can't seem to move ourselves to do the right thing, right? Okay? Which is why we're able to drive blithely past people standing on the street corner saying, we'll work for food. Okay? It's not that we're doing anything wrong to them. We didn't fire them, but we're also not helping. Okay? Which is to say, holiness is not simply refraining from wrongdoing. Holiness is actually doing the right thing. Okay? Now, end of sermon. But you see the notion here in terms of literary forms. Now, I will say, if I live to see Vatican III, or it's likely to be Kinshasa I, or Manila I, or something like that, and it's a global church, we know that. But I would urge, I will not be a bishop, I will assure you that. But maybe I'll be a Caritas, maybe I'll get Bob Carlson to take me to Kinshasa with him. But the point will be, I will urge the Council Fathers to revise this section of a document on divine revelation, because I think it's probably the weakest section. Okay, and I'll tell you why here in a second. All right, they say good things here in terms of God's covenants with Israel. In carefully planning and preparing the salvation of the whole human race, the God of infinite love, by a special dispensation, chose for himself a people to whom he would entrust his promises, first he entered into a covenant with Abraham, and through Moses with the people of Israel. To this people which he had acquired for himself, he so manifested himself through words and deeds as the one true and living God, that Israel came to know by experience the ways of God. Okay? Now all of that is absolutely, utterly complementary to both the children of Abraham and the scriptures that they composed and preserved. And that's good. That is all to the good. Frequently, we sometimes see the Old Testament as caricatured as portraying a God of wrath, and then the New Testament shows us that the God and Father of Jesus Christ is a loving God. And nothing could be further from the truth. When you actually encounter the Torah, or the prophets, or the writings, and you see what they have to say about God, God is portrayed in the prophets, the Torah, and the writings as a loving God. Okay? His people are not always obedient, but he is always loving. Right? So this is all to the good. But I would say that one of the things that they do is they say here, just sort of briefly, that these books retain lasting value. Your translation says, the plan of salvation, foretold by the sacred authors, recounted and explained by them, is found in the true word of God in the books of the Old Testament. These books, therefore, written under divine inspiration, remain permanently valuable. Okay? The problem I have with that is that it doesn't say enough. When we think about, for instance, the moral witness of the Old Testament, things like, you shall not kill, honor your father and your mother, worship the Lord your God every Sabbath. I mean, all those kinds of things. Yes, they're permanently valuable, but does that say everything we really want to say about them? When you tend to think that the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before you, our debt to the children of Abraham is precisely in that first commandment. I don't know about your ancestors. Mine were happy pagans. But I'm glad that one of them, somewhere along the line, adopted the gospel of Jesus Christ, because their liturgical practice was to strip themselves naked, paint themselves blue, and caper around oak trees. I get to worship inside. And I get to wear some cool clothes. But dancing naked around an oak tree doesn't strike me as being, well, I just wouldn't want to do it, but I'd be an atheist at that point. But you see the point, that this notion that there's one God, and that this one God is loving, you got to say more than that this is a permanently valid kind of notion. And I think that needs to be expounded upon, and needs to be elaborated. We owe the Jews an enormous debt. Secondly, okay, the economy of the Old Testament was designed to prepare for the coming of Christ, the universal Redeemer, and announce his coming by prophecy. And yes, all of that is true. But when you think about the prophets, it's not simply that they foretell the coming of the Messiah. They too give us permanently valuable lessons. Read Amos someday, when he talks about the need for us to be responsive to the cry of the poor in our midst. Okay? You read Amos, I think we can understand what Francis is talking about when he wants a church of the poor, and a church for the poor. Because this is, again, part of our theological inheritance, and it's indispensable. But directly address the coming of the Savior. It really talks about if we have any degree of humanity at all, we will recognize the humanity of people who have less than we do and share our resources with them. And that's one of those places, again, where Scripture and tradition complement one another. One of the figures that I've gotten increasingly interested in the last couple of years, mostly because I've got a student who has done a lot of work on his preaching, is a 5th century Greek-speaking theologian named John Chrysostom. He's one of the great doctors of the church. And at one point he says, he has this kind of fiery sermon that the Christians of Constantinople ought to be coming to the aid of poor people. And he says, the bread that you eat belongs to the poor. And it's a sort of hortatory expression, but the idea being that people who are poor have a legitimate claim on our resources. And he doesn't deal with, let's say, why they're poor. He doesn't care why they're poor. What he says is if they're human and they're hungry, the rest of us who are human and who are well-fed have an obligation to relieve their hunger. And of course, what does he do? He's reflecting Matthew 25. I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was sick and in prison and you came to visit me. Okay? This is not simply people acting out of benevolence. This is people acting out of recognition of the common humanity of people who are hungry and people who are well-fed, people who are homeless and people who are well-housed, people who are unhappy and people who are content. We're all human. And therefore, we're all in this together. That makes sense to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So, again, this would be one of those places that I would say, this is certainly true, but there are other truths that need to be enunciated here. And that the witness of the prophets oftentimes enunciates for us our fundamental moral obligations. Then, of course, they talk about the books of the New Testament showing forth their, about how forth, that's a misprint, they show forth their full meaning in the New Testament. And it is true. In many cases, passages that the prophets had consigned to writing only made sense in the aftermath of the Jesus event. Think about the so-called sermons that we find in Isaiah about chapter 50, where they describe this mysterious figure who suffers horribly, but somehow through his suffering, God will save his people. Okay? And it will be a light to the Gentiles, a light to the nations. That makes sense, only, it seems to me, in the light of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Which is why during, especially Holy Week, we spend a lot of time reading those suffering servant songs in the course of the liturgy. Okay? They're fascinating. All right, so it's not as though I don't think they say anything wrong here. It's not that that's not going to happen. I don't think they say enough that's right about the Hebrew Scriptures. And I'm a New Testament guy. Okay? I do occasionally teach an Old Testament class at the Institute. For the most part, I'm doing the New Testament courses. But that said, there's more to be said than what they say here. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? Then the New Testament. Okay? This is what they're at their best, I think. Okay? They endorse what we call a three-stage model, both for the formation and the transmission of the gospel. That's here in paragraph 18. The church has always and everywhere held and continues to hold the four Gospels are of apostolic origin. What the Gospels preach in fulfillment of the commission of Christ, afterwards they themselves and apostolic men, under the inspiration of the divine Spirit, handed to us in writing the foundation of faith, namely the fourfold Gospel, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let's unpack this a little bit. We know what happened to stage one. Stage one is ground zero, apart from which nothing else would be possible. That is what Jesus actually said and did. And we know when that ended. The conventional date for the end of Jesus' ministry is 33, right? That's when we think that he was crucified, died, and rose again. Now here's the point. Jesus wrote nothing. Okay? His teachings were transmitted entirely orally, and we know that he spoke Aramaic, and probably, I've got perhaps here, but I've only strengthened that a little bit more, I would say probably Hebrew as well. Because there's evidence that Hebrew, which had almost died, was in the state of being revived in the 1st century. Okay? But entirely, he wrote nothing, including, I mean, you can't count what he was doing in John's Gospel, where the woman brought adultery is brought before him, and he kneels down and he writes in the dust. Okay? That blows away. Okay? Was he literate? I think so. Yes. I mean, he certainly knows he could write. Could he write? Probably. Okay? Judaism prized literature, but he didn't sit down and write the Gospel according to me. Okay? He transmitted his teachings orally, and that probably speaks about the kind of people to whom he spoke. These were poor people for whom books were luxury goods, so he fashions his teaching in a way that's easily memorizable and easily transmissible. So if you memorize something, you can also put it in somebody else's head, and they can memorize it. Okay? And think about how many of those sayings of Jesus really are easily memorizable. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Unless you take up your cross daily and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. Can you think of any others? Put you on the spot. And if somebody asks, is there going to be a test? No. And I lied and said no. And there is. And it's right now. Okay? I'll give you a moment to think. But stage 2. This is the proclamation of the gospel by the apostolic generation. That's what we're talking about here. We know when that happens also. From the time of the Lord's death and resurrection until more or less the year 70. Okay? Initially that would have been oral. Probably also initially in Aramaic, but eventually written down, we think, in a kind of an anthology of the sayings of Jesus. It would have been initially, well, eventually, all of the sayings of Jesus would have survived only in Greek. Okay? While Jesus himself spoke Aramaic, his words are only preserved in the Greek language. And that, again, points to the demographics of early Christianity. Most people were Greek speakers because it arose in the Eastern and the Mediterranean, where Greek was the common language. You know, if the Lord had decided to come to the Philippines, he might have spoken Tagalog, but it may well be that the words of Jesus would have only been preserved in Spanish, maybe. Or maybe English, who knows? Because some of this is simply a response to demographics. You pray to God and you remember the words of God in the language you're remembering, right? It's preserved, we think, in 3 contexts. Certainly in the liturgy. That seems to be the privileged context where people remembered what Jesus had said and done. But also preserved what we call didache, catechesis, teaching. But this is teaching devoted to insiders, to people who are already baptized, to be distinguished from the kerygma, which is the proclamation to people who are not yet baptized, but whom you are inviting into the church. And usually the kerygma is Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. That's the most succinct formula for the kerygma. Okay? Which the words and deeds of Jesus were remembered and preserved. Then the 3rd stage is the work of the evangelists. Now, this is written entirely, and it's written only in Greek. There is no Aramaic version of the gospel. There is no Hebrew version of the gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all written in Greek, and a fairly easy Greek to remember. I always tell my students that if you start studying Greek with me in September, you can read the Gospel of John by December if you do your homework. Okay? Because it's not hard to learn. People get sort of, scared of the alphabet, but I can teach that to you in 20 minutes. How many of you retired? What else have you got to do with your time? Better that than watch an opera. Okay? And then you can read John's Gospel in the original. Wouldn't that be great? Yes, Father, that would be wonderful. No, thank you. Okay. Now, here's when we think it was probably written. We think Mark's is probably the earliest of the Gospels because it's the shortest of the Gospels. Okay? Because here's a good history lesson. The shorter the version of the saying or the story, the earlier the version of the saying or the story. Shorter is most of the time earlier. How many here are fishermen? Okay? You tell the story about the fish that got away? Always. What happens to that fish? It gets bigger with every retelling of the story, doesn't it? Okay? Yeah, until it's the freaking whale that rescued Jonah that you missed in the Lake of the Ozarks. Who knew that that's where that whale ended up? Okay? But you see the point. Repetition usually means augmentation. So the shorter, the earlier. The version of Mark's the shortest, is probably earlier. We think it's probably around 70, but if it turns out it's 68 or if it's 72, you know what? This does not affect our salvation. It does not. But I think it's reasonable to assume, because there's probably reflected in Mark's Gospel, specifically in chapter 13, a mention of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. That we know when that happens. That happens in the year 70. And it was those blasted Romans who did it. I'm not a big fan of the Roman Empire. I think they were the Nazis of the ancient world, seriously. And they destroyed the temple. And what happened was both Christianity at that point separates, it had been an ongoing process, but definitively separates from Judaism at the year 70, but Judaism also remakes itself. Okay? And that's a whole different story. But it's a fascinating story to think how this people completely rethought their own religious life. And rethought it in ways that were strikingly innovative and creative. Okay? Matthew and Luke were probably contemporaries of one another, probably about 15 years after the composition of Mark's Gospel, and they seem to use Mark as a source, along with a collection of the sayings of Jesus that we call Q, from the Greek word kvele, which means source. That's all. Okay? And then finally, John's Gospel, we think, is probably written in the last decade of the 1st century, probably midway through that last decade, because it too seems to reflect internally relations between Christians and Jews, particularly in terms of the expulsion of Christians from synagogues, which we know happens in the early 90s. So the point is that the Gospels themselves, there weren't people walking around behind Jesus taking notes. You know? There weren't people like Jim filming it. You know? It is simply people remembering, though I will say this, that in a culture that is defined by orality, memory can be very, very persistent. Okay? In ways that you and I don't do. And I got to have it written down for me. If it's not written down for me, forget about it. And in fact, it's got to be written down in a couple of different places. It's got to be on my iPhone. It's got to be on my computer at work. It's got to be on my computer at home. It needs to show up. I'll get a phone call every now and again. You know, Sister Gladden calling me and saying, "We're expecting you out here in 20 minutes." "Oh yes, Sister, I'll be right there." Okay? On the way. Okay? Then I pray to Philippine to clear the traffic for me. Okay? And you know what? She does. She's like, "You're taking care of my children, I'm going to take care of you." Okay? But the point being that in all of this, even though you got, 40 years between Mark and stage 1, or even 60, or what is that? Yeah, 60 years between John and stage 1, we still think these accurately reproduce both the words and the deeds of Jesus. Okay? Because of the persistence of memory in an oral culture. They didn't have to write stuff down. They just had to memorize it. Yeah, Frank?
Back in stage 1, since Jesus grew up in Nazareth,
well, Sepphoris, which is the town next to Nazareth, the new town, it's kind of like, new town and St. Charles itself, right? It was Greek-speaking. John Meyer, who writes this now almost 5-volume work called A Marginal Jew, in the first volume called Mentor and Message, speculates, that's all it is, that Jesus was not just bilingual, maybe trilingual, that he spoke Aramaic, Hebrew, and he says Greek because the family is in the building trade. They're said to be artisans, carpenters, whatever, and he speculates again, that maybe they were involved in the construction of this new town called Sepphoris. All of that, there is no proof for it in the New Testament at all. I mean, all we know is that he was a carpenter. And that his father was a carpenter, because everybody does what their dads did. Okay? But beyond that, I mean, as much as I respect Meyer and I've learned from him, I think we got to sort of say it's possible We can't even go to plausible in terms of historical probabilities. It's possible, not plausible, and probably not even